What I wanted to do today was to show you how we're doing things here back in Wales, and what we're doing with our groundbreaking piece of legislation, the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. Now, I don't know how many of you have been lucky enough to have been to Wales or even to have heard about what we're doing, but to set some context, we are a relatively small country as part of the UK. We have a population of around 3 million people. Interestingly enough, that's just slightly smaller than the population here in Dubai. But what as a nation we may lack in size, we certainly make up for in terms of our ambition. And whilst the issues being discussed here at the World Government Summit are of course affecting issues on a global scale, sometimes it's the small actions that make a difference. Or as a Japanese writer said, individually we might be a drop, but together we are an ocean. So today what I hope Wales are doing for the well-being of future generations through our unique legislation will be a ripple across all four corners of the globe. And in Wales and in the Welsh language we have a rather nice word. That word is dysgu, and it means both to teach and to learn, and I think that's very much what we're all doing here in this summit, teaching each other and learning from each other. But what I wanted to start with is this young man. This is Usman, and Usman lives in a place called Betus, which is a large social housing estate in a city called Newport back in Wales. And I met Usman on a visit to his primary school back last month. And this is Betus. It's not a particularly nice place to live. It's an area of high socio-economic deprivation. There are high levels of unemployment in the area. Around about 40% of people in this area are unemployed. Crime, poverty, drugs and alcohol problems are sadly an everyday reality despite the very close-knit community there. And for Millbrook Primary School, 34% of their children have special educational needs. 30% are from families with low incomes. So we could almost map out the life courses or the life chances of these children. So children who have experienced multiple adversity, we know in Wales are 20 times more likely to end up in prison when they become adults. They're more likely to develop long-term health problems, and they're much less likely to be in employment when they become adults. But there's a really determined head teacher in this school, and she has vowed to change that. And the school actually uses the lens of the Sustainable Development Goals and our own Welsh national wellbeing goals to plan their work, and it places a huge emphasis on kindness, on doing small things for each other that make a big difference, and it recognises the interconnections and role we all play in our wellbeing as individuals and society. Now, Usman was quite shy and reluctant to get involved in lessons, and he, like very many children in that school, has experienced several issues of adversity. But the focus that the school has put on supporting pupils has not only built their level of aspiration for themselves, but also for the planet, because their work on the SDGs has enabled them to understand the connections between their own well-being and that of the planet. And Usman told me how he wants to become an architect, and he's already designed a house which would be built into the side of one of our very many Welsh hillsides, using the natural typography and having benefits in terms of energy efficiency. And Usman is 10, but he knows that that's really important in terms of meeting our carbon reduction targets. And Usman, of course, is a representative of our future generations. He's the representative of the sorts of future generations that we need, future generations that have an understanding of the skills that we will need to protect our planet and have kindness and respect for each other and for our world. And a few days after meeting Usman, I spoke at a conference with the construction sector in Wales, and I spoke about how the skills that we need for the future were evident in that school, that we must be educating our children to meet the challenges of the future, to help us tackle climate change, to be able to thrive and stay safe in a world of artificial intelligence and where data is the new gold. We need to make sure that they understand that they are not just global consumers, but of course they are global citizens. And critically, we need to educate them not just for another pointless job, but for a life well lived. And I was delighted to see through the medium of Twitter that a very generous lady who was inspired by hearing my story about Usman sent him this book on cool architecture to help him take forward his dreams. And we can see here that someone is showing an act of kindness to a future generation. Someone's investing in a future generation and empowering them to go on and to create their own future. And this is a small act of kindness, but what we really need is for all of us to show kindness to our future generations, to demonstrate that our decisions take into account not just our people now, but the needs and well-being issues of our younger generations and indeed those yet to be born. Because when it comes down to it, I think no matter where we are in the world, no matter where we're from or what we stand for, our longing to make the world a better place for future generations is unquestionably universal. It's of course what unites us, but it's also what should drive us to act at a greater pace, taking the actions that we know need to be taken to leave the world in a better place than we found it. And yet somehow, when it gets down to it, for some reason, that often gets lost. When it comes down to taking important decisions, the question of well-being is often nobody's business. And I think for too long we've thought that the defining measure of well-being has been around a nation's GDP or economic growth. So economists, historians, politicians and business leaders have obsessed over GDP and growth, but can we really say that this obsession has made people's lives better? And the vast inequalities that we see across the world, our threatened natural environment and our plummeting natural resources are proof, I think, that GDP alone is not a good measure of the well-being of our people or planet. And of course, it was Robert Kennedy back in the 1960s who questioned this obsession about GDP, saying the problem with GDP is that it measures everything in life except that which makes life worthwhile. And I know that this is something that Her Excellency the Minister for Happiness discussed during her panel session at Davos last month. And if I were to ask you what makes you happy, I doubt very much you would say economic growth. You'd say things like we just heard Tony talk about. You'd say spending time with your families or loved ones or friends, music, sport, good food, literature, the beauty of our environment and the world around us. And it's all of these things together and holistically that make our lives worthwhile. And it's these things that increasingly governments must recognise in what could otherwise become a very disjointed and dystopian world. And that's why I'm really proud that in Wales we have this piece of legislation called the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. And it's a pioneering piece of legislation that looks to improve the social, economic, environmental and cultural well-being of Wales. And note the addition there of cultural well-being, which is part of what makes our legislation so unique. Our legislation places a statutory duty on all of our public bodies in Wales, or all of our main public bodies in Wales, including the government, to have to demonstrate how they've thought about the long-term impact of their decisions. It places a duty on them to carry out sustainable development, whereby they must act in a manner which seeks to ensure that the needs of the present are met without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And our Act is internationally groundbreaking. There's a quote here from the United Nations. We hope what Wales is doing today, the world will do tomorrow. Wales remains the first and only country in the world to legislate in this way and to look at all four pillars of well-being. And critically, those four pillars of well-being are on an equal footing, so we can no longer have a position where the economy trumps the environment. All of those four pillars have to be considered equally. And of course, what Wales has been doing is very closely linked to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And you can see how there is this alignment to the SDGs and our own national wellbeing goals. And I think sustainable development has always played quite a significant part in at least some of Wales's journey in terms of devolution. And we can see that the decision to legislate in this way for sustainable development was closely linked to Rio 20 Earth Summit in 2012. But as I said, in 2015, we took this decision to go one step further in legislating ourselves. And some of the key things that our legislation does. So we set out 7 national wellbeing goals. So this is the vision for the Wales that we want to see. And these 7 national wellbeing goals were actually devised as part of a national conversation which happened across the length and breadth of Wales, involving over 10,000 people. So the people in Wales came up with these wellbeing goals themselves. And what they also came up with was some really progressive definitions of these wellbeing goals. So if we look, I don't know if you can read it there, but if we look at our definition of prosperity, we talk about a productive, innovative and low carbon society, which uses resources efficiently and proportionately, including acting on climate change. It talks about a well-educated population with good skills and access to decent jobs, not just any old jobs. And so our definition of prosperity is really quite progressive. And when you look at that in conjunction with our other 6 wellbeing goals, and they all have to be looked at holistically, so each one of our public bodies has a duty to maximise their contribution to all 7 of those wellbeing goals, we can see how our vision for Wales through these interconnected wellbeing goals is really challenging business as usual. The other thing that our legislation does is set out 5 new ways of working. So if you like, the ingredients for how we're going to get towards this vision of the Wales that we want. So our government and our public bodies must demonstrate that they are thinking and planning for the long term. They must demonstrate that they are taking preventative action. And we all know that old adage of prevention is better than cure, but actually when it comes down to investing in prevention, when it comes down from taking spending from the acute end of public services to invest in preventing problems from occurring in the first place, that's incredibly difficult, but that is now a statutory duty in Wales. It also requires us to integrate our decision making. So that's recognising the interconnection between all of our 7 wellbeing goals. So it's no longer the responsibility of the Economic Development Department in government to just think about the economy. It's as much their duty to think about the environment, it's as much their duty to think about the impact on the culture of Wales for the decisions they take, and so on. And that is the same duty for each of the 44 public bodies covered by the Act. The 4th principle is collaboration. So this is a recognition that no one public body or sector can solve the challenges that we face now and the challenges that we will face in the future alone. So we must collaborate and work together in partnership. And the 5th way of working is around involvement. So involving people who are affected by decisions in that decision-making process. And involvement is a much more active form, a much more active word than sometimes what we get used to in government consultation. High-level consultations that don't really reflect the lived experiences of the citizens that we're developing policy and services for. And so that word involvement is really crucial in terms of how our legislation is taken forward here in Wales. So we are almost 3 years into the legislation, so what change has happened? I talk about this regularly, not just about being a journey towards change, but probably more of an expedition, because what we're trying to do here through embedding those 5 ways of working are to change the habits of very many lifetimes. It's very difficult for governments to plan for the long term. It's really difficult to shift resources from the acute end to the preventative end, but that is what we're we're required to do. And this here is an example of one of the big impacts that our legislation is already driving. So this was a procurement of a new rail franchise in Wales, the biggest contract ever let in Wales, a £5 billion contract for rail and metro services. And because of our legislation, the private sector who were tendering for this contract were required to demonstrate how that contract was not just going to deliver new trains and faster trains and more efficient trains, as important that is, but they were required to demonstrate how they were going to contribute through that £5 billion contract to all 7 of our wellbeing goals. And you can see here some of the things that they have said that they will do. So low carbon trains, all of the stations will be zero carbon, reduced fares for people coming from areas with high deprivation, a focus on social enterprises and local business provision in stations, and they are mapping that out across each one of our 7 wellbeing goals. The Wellbeing of Future Generations Act is also driving action in our capital city, who as a result have set a target to shift from an 80% use of cars as the main way of getting about the capital city to a 50% modal shift. And the sorts of things that they're doing there are cycle superhighways, they're introducing next bikes, they're the first local authority in Wales to have procured electric buses, and they've actually brought in a public health official to help map out their public transport strategy. And then some smaller things, our hospitals. One hospital in Wales in particular has reflected not just on investing in medical equipment, as important as that is, but actually they've built in an art gallery into their hospital. They've built an orchard in their hospital, which is helping them to ease recuperation for patients and also bringing in local communities to work there. So I think we're making a huge impact in terms of what we're doing in Wales with this Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, and not least because this year the government have also agreed to set a definition of preventative spend in their budget. So I've talked a lot about the challenges of shifting to prevention. My role as a Commissioner is to challenge the government on how they are moving to that preventative spend, and we had to start by doing that by having a definition. So this is a definition that the government in Wales have now agreed. This is a definition that will be used to map spend in all future budgets. As far as I'm aware, we're the first country to have set such a definition. It is going to be a long process, but having that definition set up initially is an important part of that. We've also reformed planning policy in Wales. So planning policy in Wales is now reflecting the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act requirements. It puts, for example, fossil fuel use at the bottom of the energy hierarchy. It focuses on placemaking. It requires decisions on planning and infrastructure to show how they're contributing to the social, economic, environmental and cultural wellbeing of Wales. And whilst I work very closely with the government, I am an independent commissioner, and that poses some challenges on occasions. So one of the things that I've intervened on is plans that have been on the books of government for a significant period of time to spend most of our borrowing capacity in Wales on an extension to a motorway. And interestingly, what we can see now is that that decision has been paused. The interventions that I have made, the points and the legal arguments around how the government will comply with the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act are looking as though they may well drive a different form of decision making in relation to this issue. So we do have some significant achievements already just 3 years into the legislation, but I am acutely aware that actually, in order to drive the changes that we really want to see, this is about cultural change, and legislation isn't always synonymous with cultural change. I think often how we do public policy, certainly in the UK, and I'm sure probably across the world, is that we have some really good ideas and innovation. We'll have policy and legislation, and sometimes, if you're really lucky, some finance to implement those good ideas. But the bit we often forget is people, hearts and minds. And that's why I call this an expedition, because we've got 3 million hearts and minds to change in Wales, thousands and thousands of public sector workers and policymakers who have been taking decisions perhaps in the wrong way for very many years. And it's those people that we need to focus on, but our legislation is certainly giving us a significant and fighting chance to help win them over. Thank you.